Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the winter of 1924, Moscow fell silent. Vladimir Lenin, the architect of the revolution, was dead. Crowds filled the streets to see his coffin, their breath hanging in the freezing air. The man who had built a new world lay motionless beneath red flags, and in that stillness the future began to twist. Inside the Communist Party, grief quickly turned to calculation. The question was not how to honor Lenin, but who would replace him. Among the contenders stood Leon Trotsky, brilliant, fiery, adored by soldiers, and Joseph Stalin, the quiet organizer who had mastered the machinery of the party. Stalin's strength was not charisma, but patience. He spoke little, listened often, and took note of every weakness. Trotsky represented revolution as faith. Stalin represented it as structure. While Trotsky gave speeches that electrified the masses, Stalin built alliances in silence, placing loyal men in key posts, turning the party bureaucracy into his weapon. By 1927, the balance had shifted. Trotsky was outmaneuvered, expelled, and soon exiled. Stalin, who had begun as the keeper of records, became the keeper of power. From that moment, his vision for the Soviet Union hardened. The revolution would no longer be guided by debate or ideology, but by control. To Stalin, the party was not a collection of thinkers, it was an engine, and he was the engineer. The purpose was no longer freedom, but endurance. He began reshaping the nation's foundations. The first 5-year plan demanded impossible targets. Industrial cities built from wilderness coal and steel production multiplied overnight. Villages were stripped of grain to feed factories that barely existed. Posters proclaimed progress, even as famine spread through the countryside. The dream of equality had become a command. Stalin believed in transformation through struggle. In his mind, suffering was not a failure of socialism, but proof of its necessity. Those who resisted peasants, intellectuals, even fellow revolutionaries, were labeled as enemies of progress. He did not yet call it a purge, but the idea was already forming that the state must be cleansed for the future to survive. By the late 1920s, Stalin's power was complete. Trotsky had fled abroad, and every voice that could challenge him had been silenced. But behind the triumph was unease. The revolution that once promised liberation was beginning to resemble the tyranny it had destroyed. And at its center stood a man who believed that history itself could be ruled if only enough people feared him. The stage was set. The dream of Lenin was about to become the nightmare of Stalin. By the time Trotsky's ship drifted out of the Black Sea, Stalin had already begun to reshape the Soviet Union in his image. What Lenin had built through conviction, he would preserve through control. To Stalin, ideology was not faith, but structure, and the foundation of that structure would be fear. In 1928, he unveiled the first 5-year plan, a blueprint for transforming the USSR from an agrarian society into an industrial titan. The goals were impossibly high coal to double steel, to triple entire cities to rise from wilderness. Posters declared triumphs that did not yet exist, while in the villages farmers were stripped of land and hope. Collectivization arrived like a storm. Land, livestock, and labor were seized in the name of the state, and those who resisted were branded kulaks, enemies of progress. Trains carried entire families eastward into exile, while the fields they left behind rotted from neglect. Stalin called it modernization. The people called it survival. The famine that followed devoured the countryside. In Ukraine, known later as the Holodomor, borders were sealed, grain confiscated, and villages starved into submission. People ate bark, leather, even earth. Millions perished while rail cars full of food left for export. Stalin saw not tragedy, but proof that the weak were being purged for the sake of history. Meanwhile, in the cities, newspapers told another story. Headlines celebrated record harvests and posters showed happy workers in endless fields of grain. The lie was complete reality, rewritten by ink and terror. Silence became a form of patriotism, and questioning was treason. Within the party, Stalin's suspicion deepened. Those who had marched beside Lenin were now potential traitors. Conversations grew cautious, smiles rehearsed. The NKVD, his secret police, listened through walls and read every letter. The state had learned to see through eyes that were not its own. By the early 1930s, the revolution had mutated into something both magnificent and monstrous. Skyscrapers rose over Moscow, while villages were buried beneath hunger. Stalin believed he was forging steel out of chaos, but what he created was an empire of obedience. Each new victory demanded a scapegoat, and each scapegoat made him stronger. The foundation of fear had been poured. Soon the walls of terror would rise. By 1934, the Soviet Union glittered with the illusion of progress. Moscow gleamed with new boulevards. Factories roared to life, and parades filled the streets with banners of Lenin and Stalin side by side. But beneath the celebration cracks were forming. The revolution that once united millions was being consumed by suspicion. Among Stalin's comrades stood Sergei Kirov, young, confident, and admired. His charisma rivaled Stalin's authority. His speeches drew louder applause, and his popularity spread across the party like warmth in a frozen room. Stalin smiled beside him at congresses, but the smile never reached his eyes. The man who trusted no one now saw a rival adored by everyone. On December 1st, 1934, Kirov was shot dead in Leningrad by Leonid Nikolaev, a disgruntled former party member. The assassination shocked the nation, but the investigation was stranger still. Security around Kirov had been inexplicably withdrawn, and Nikolaev, a man already under surveillance, had walked into the Smolny Institute unchallenged. The official story was swift and unconvincing. Within hours, Stalin declared that Kirov's death was proof of a vast conspiracy. He spoke of Trotskyites and enemies of socialism, plotting from within. The nation obeyed. Thousands were arrested in Leningrad alone, hundreds executed. The logic was simple: if one man had fired the gun, hundreds must have helped him load it. The NKVD under Genrikh Yagoda began its work. Lists grew overnight. Interrogations turned into rehearsed confessions. Families vanished between dusk and dawn. The fear that Stalin had once imagined became real, a living force, self-sustaining, contagious. Kirov's murder became the perfect pretext. The dictator no longer needed an excuse to silence dissent. The people now demanded it for him. Newspapers declared the party is pure only when purged. Those who hesitated were suspected of sympathy. Every denunciation was rewarded. Whispers spread through the Kremlin that Stalin himself had ordered the killing, but none dared speak it aloud. The truth no longer mattered, only loyalty did. The revolution that had once sought to build equality was learning to feed on obedience. The first blood had been spilled, and the machinery of terror was awakening. The death of Sergei Kirov became the justification for a new kind of revolution, one that turned inward. Stalin spoke of vigilance, of cleansing the party from within, and the people listened. By 1935, the Soviet Union had become a nation divided between watchers and the watched. Fear replaced debate. Silence replaced loyalty. The NKVD, still under Genrikh Yagoda, moved quietly at first. Men and women were dismissed from their posts, stripped of party cards, and exiled to remote settlements. But soon the cleansing grew bolder. Interrogators demanded confessions not to uncover guilt, but to invent it. Each arrest justified the next. Each confession proved the system worked. Those who had once stood beside Lenin Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and others became the first victims of Stalin's paranoia. They were accused of conspiring with Trotsky, plotting to assassinate Stalin, even collaborating with foreign powers. The accusations were absurd, yet resistance was futile. After weeks of torture, they confessed to everything written for them. In August 1936, the first Moscow show trial opened beneath towering portraits of Stalin. The defendants recited their confessions like actors in a play, their voices hollow but disciplined. The prosecutor thundered accusations, the audience applauded, and the verdict was preordained. All were shot within days. The performance was a masterpiece of fear, designed to teach the nation that even the loyal could be guilty. Outside the courtroom, the purges spread. Teachers, engineers, and factory workers were arrested for sabotage or insufficient enthusiasm. Farmers who failed to meet quotas were labeled wreckers. A missing tool or broken machine could condemn an entire workshop. In every neighborhood, citizens began to whisper names desperate to prove their own devotion. The culture of denunciation became national ritual. Children were praised for reporting their parents. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid being seen together. To survive, one had to vanish into obedience. Stalin's image, calm, paternal, omnipresent, hung in every office, every school, every courtroom. He appeared to be the nation's protector even as he devoured it. When Yagoda's pace slowed, Stalin replaced him with Nikolai Yezhov, a small man with quick eyes and boundless zeal. Under Yezhov, the purges would become an industry systematic, statistical, and unstoppable. The soil of the revolution was ready. All it needed now was blood. The first Moscow show trial had proven that terror could be staged, and the audience had learned their lines. In August 1936, the marble columns of the Hall of Unions in Moscow gleamed beneath bright lights as cameras clicked and guards stood at attention. At the center sat Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, men who had once helped Lenin seize power, now condemned as traitors to the revolution they had built. The prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky thundered accusations like scripture. He called the defendants mad dogs and vermin who had betrayed socialism for fascism. Every outburst drew applause from the crowd. The defendants, thin and sleepless, recited their confessions without resistance. Yes, Kamenev said, his eyes fixed on the floor. I am guilty before the people. The hall erupted in cheers. Outside newspapers called the trial a triumph of vigilance. Radio broadcasts repeated the confessions as proof that the party was cleansing itself. Citizens listened uneasy but obedient. If Zinoviev and Kamenev, founders of the revolution, were traitors, then no one was safe. The logic of terror was complete guilt was no longer proven, it was performed. A year later came the second act, the trial of the 17. The charges were even more fantastic: collaboration with Germany and Japan's sabotage of factories, assassination plots. Western journalists attended expecting justice and left uncertain. The evidence was incoherent, but the verdicts were clear. All but 4 were executed. The rest were sent to labor camps where none would survive. Behind the scenes, the interrogations were pure nightmare. Defendants were deprived of sleep, beaten until delirious, forced to rehearse confessions like scripts. In the front row of the courtroom, NKVD officers sat in silent warning reminders of what would happen if a line was forgotten. By now, Stalin understood the value of spectacle. The trials were not about punishing real crimes, but about teaching obedience. Each broadcast confession was a lesson in fear, each applause a test of loyalty. The people learned to cheer the condemned even as they trembled for themselves. At night, the condemned were driven to the Lubyanka's basement, their names read from lists, their bodies buried in anonymous graves outside Moscow. Official reports described their executions as resolutions. The applause had stopped. Only the machinery kept moving. By 1937, terror had evolved into a system no longer commanded but automated. The Great Purge had become a machine that fed on its own momentum. Stalin no longer needed to give orders for every arrest. The structure he built now worked without him. Local officials competed to expose enemies driven by fear and ambition in equal measure. The NKVD received its most chilling directive, Order No. 0047. Issued in July 1937, it demanded the elimination of anti-Soviet elements. The language was bureaucratic, but its meaning was clear: quotas for death. Each district was told how many enemies to find, how many to imprison, and how many to execute. Success was measured not in grain or steel, but in corpses. Special tribunals known as troikas were created to deliver judgment. 3 officials, an NKVD officer, a party secretary, and a prosecutor, met in secret rooms to decide hundreds of fates in a single day. No defense, no evidence, no trial. A signature meant death. A hesitation meant suspicion. One survivor later said, "The ink on their pens was our blood." The numbers exploded. By the end of 1937, nearly 800,000 people had been executed. Prison trains ran day and night toward the gulags, their windows painted shut. In Moscow, trucks rolled quietly through the streets at midnight, carrying prisoners to Butovo or Komunarka, where firing squads worked until dawn. The ground froze faster than the bodies could be buried. Terror reached every corner of society. A careless joke, a forgotten salute, a neighbor's accusation, any could end a life. Families kept suitcases packed by the door in case of arrest. Children learned not to cry when parents were taken away. Survival meant invisibility. Inside the NKVD itself, paranoia reigned. Interrogators who failed to meet quotas were accused of sympathizing with the enemy. Many were executed by their own colleagues. Those who remained drank to forget, then returned to work before dawn. In the midst of it all, Stalin appeared calm, even paternal. He gave speeches about vigilance, smiled for photographs, and spoke of cleansing the nation for a brighter future. His blue pencil continued to cross out names on lists methodically without emotion. Each stroke of ink carried a death sentence. The purge was now a living thing feeding on the fear it created, and Stalin, its creator, mistook the horror for strength. The year 1937 became the zenith of the Great Purge, a year when death was measured in statistics. Stalin no longer asked who was guilty, only how many. Across the Soviet Union, quotas turned murder into mathematics. Reports to Moscow read like production summaries: enemies liquidated TUI-300. Objective exceeded by 38%. The NKVD's efficiency became its own justification. Each region competed to outdo the next, sending telegrams boasting of overfulfilled plans. When their lists of suspects ran dry, officials created new ones. Failure to deliver results was proof of disloyalty. The logic was perfect, circular, and unstoppable. The troikas sat daily, their work endless. In one office, a single typewriter recorded hundreds of death sentences a night. The meetings lasted until dawn, 3 men signing names faster than they could be read. Files were marked: Category 1 for execution, Category 2 for imprisonment. No appeal, no delay. It was not justice, it was arithmetic. Prisons swelled until the walls themselves seemed to suffocate. In cells meant for 1050 prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, sleeping in shifts. The air stank of fear, sweat, and rot. Guards worked without pause, dragging men and women to interrogation rooms where the screams never stopped. A signature was all it took to end the noise. Execution grounds such as Butovo and Levashovo became factories of silence. Trucks arrived hourly with prisoners bound in ropes, their names already struck from the records. 1 bullet for each. By sunrise, the pits were full, and the next convoy was waiting. The ground froze over before the snow fell, hiding the proof until spring. Outside the prison walls, the rhythm of daily life continued. Newspapers printed new slogans, radios played cheerful songs, and schools taught children to identify spies. In every city, portraits of Stalin hung above the words, "He sees everything." It was no longer propaganda, it was faith through fear. By the year's end, more than 1 million had been arrested and over 700,000 executed. The Soviet Union was devouring itself with bureaucratic precision, a nation reduced to numbers on a page. The terror had become so vast that even those enforcing it no longer believed they would survive. The machine was still running, but no one was left to steer it. By the summer of 1937, Stalin's paranoia had reached its purest form. His gaze, once fixed on peasants and politicians, turned toward the institution he had most reason to trust, the Red Army. The men who had built the revolution's shield were now accused of plotting its destruction. What had begun as whispers in dark corridors became official orders sealed with Stalin's blue pencil. The arrests came swiftly. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant military minds of his generation, was dragged from his office in May. He and 7 top commanders were charged with treason, accused of collaborating with Germany and plotting a coup. The evidence was forged, the confessions extracted through torture. Within weeks they were shot. The generals who had crushed the Civil War now fell beneath the same bullet they once commanded. Fear consumed the officer corps. Out of 5 marshals, 3 were executed. Thousands of colonels and captains vanished into the gulags. Commanders were replaced overnight by men with no experience, chosen for loyalty rather than skill. The Red Army, once a disciplined force, became a body without a spine. Across the barracks, silence reigned. Officers stopped giving orders that might be misinterpreted. Soldiers avoided speaking above a whisper. Strategy meetings turned into recitations of party slogans. The purges that had once targeted politicians now crippled the very defense of the Soviet state. Yet Stalin saw only strength. He believed that by destroying potential rivals, he had secured absolute control. When foreign diplomats expressed concern over the sudden disappearance of senior officers, he dismissed them with a smile. "We have no traitors now," he said. "Only loyal men remain." But the price was catastrophic. The army's heart had been torn out on the eve of the greatest war it would ever face. The world beyond the Soviet borders was shifting, rearming, watching. Stalin, standing at the center, mistook the convulsions for strength. But among all the enemies he invented, none would wound him or his country more deeply than the ones he created within his own army. By late 1937, the Soviet Union had become a graveyard without markers. Entire families disappeared in the night, and by morning their names had been erased from public records. The word enemy had lost all meaning it could apply to a poet, a farmer, a teacher, or the man who delivered the mail. The machinery of repression moved so quickly that even its operators no longer knew why. The NKVD's work was methodical. Each city had its execution ground, Butovo near Moscow, Levashovo near Leningrad, and countless others hidden beneath forests and fields. Prisoners arrived blindfolded, their names checked off one last time. A bullet to the base of the skull, a shallow pit, and then the next truck. Some sites saw thousands killed in a single night. Families were forbidden from asking questions. Official letters described the condemned as sentenced to 10 years without correspondence, a phrase that became known as a death sentence in disguise. Mothers waited years at train stations for sons who would never return. Children grew up in orphanages, their parents' names erased for fear of contamination. In Moscow, the Lubyanka prison overflowed. Its cellars echoed with the hum of typewriters and the muted cracks of gunfire. In the gulags, prisoners built roads that led nowhere, logging timber for cities they would never see. The Arctic winds carried the sound of hammers and shovels, the rhythm of a nation digging its own silence. The terror did not discriminate by birth or belief. Engineers were accused of sabotage for a machine that broke. Scientists were shot for failed experiments. Writers were jailed for metaphors that could be misread. Art intellect and individuality became crimes against the state. Stalin's vision of order required chaos beneath it. The NKVD's quotas, those deadly numbers, had begun to devour even the innocent with mechanical indifference. Bureaucrats executed strangers to meet their targets, fearing they would be next if they fell short. Clerks became killers by pen their signatures as lethal as bullets. The purge no longer served Stalin's will. It served itself. And yet, every dawn, the propaganda continued. Posters proclaimed life has become better, life has become happier, while trains carried the condemned to frozen camps. The dissonance was complete, a nation smiling over its own graves. In the quiet of those forests beneath the snow lay the truth of Stalin's revolution, not the building of a new world, but the burial of an entire generation. The Red Army, the pride of the revolution, the shield of the Soviet Union, was now a ghost of itself. The purge that began with Marshal Tukhachevsky did not stop at the high command. It cascaded downward through every rank, tearing out the experience and confidence that had once made the Soviet military formidable. What remained was an army terrified of its own reflection. Of 5 marshals, 3 were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, and half of the corps and divisional officers followed. The NKVD stormed barracks and headquarters, dragging away men in uniform whose medals still gleamed from recent parades. Some were shot the same night. Others were sent to the gulags to vanish in snow and silence. Stalin had created an army that feared him more than it feared the enemy. The scale was staggering. More than 30,000 officers were removed in less than a year. Some units lost all their senior leadership in a single week. Promotions came not through merit, but through blind allegiance. A man's survival depended on his ability to recite the party line, not command a regiment. The Red Army had become a monument to obedience and incompetence. Foreign observers were appalled. German intelligence officers noted with astonishment how thoroughly Stalin had crippled his own defenses. Inside the Kremlin, however, the dictator saw only security. By removing potential rivals, he believed he had ensured his dominance forever. His logic was simple: without capable generals, no coup could ever threaten him. The flaw invisible to him then would soon define the century. The damage went beyond strategy. The army's spirit, forged in revolution, tempered by civil war, was broken. Veterans who had once fought with faith in the cause now whispered their doubts in darkness. Some drank themselves into numbness. Others waited for the knock that never came. Every command, every salute was shadowed by fear. Beyond the Soviet borders, the world changed rapidly. In Europe, fascism rearmed. In Asia, Japan marched across China. The drums of war grew louder. and yet the Soviet Union's shield had been shattered by its own leader. Stalin's paranoia had achieved what no foreign power could: the disarmament of his empire from within. The Red Army would rebuild in time, but at a terrible cost. The lessons of 1937 would echo through 1941, when Hitler's armies came east, and Stalin finally learned what it meant to be unprepared. While the army bled from within, another quieter war unfolded across the Soviet Union. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin turned his gaze toward those whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a border. Entire ethnic communities, Poles, Finns, Germans, Koreans, Chinese, and many others were declared potential traitors. Loyalty was no longer measured by words or deeds, but by ancestry. The most brutal of these campaigns was the NKVD Polish operation. Over 100,000 ethnic Poles were executed. Tens of thousands more disappeared into gulags. Many were not even Polish by nationality, only suspected of having a Polish name, a Polish neighbor, or Polish blood. The efficiency of the killings was staggering in some regions. Executions continued day and night, the gunfire muffled by engines running outside. In the western borderlands, entire villages were wiped off the map. Fathers were taken first, then mothers, then the children labeled socially dangerous. NKVD Order 00486 sealed their fate. Wives of traitors were to be sent to labor camps, their children to orphanages. Families vanished from the census as if they had never existed. The Soviet state had discovered how to make people not just die, but disappear. Similar fates befell others. Koreans in the Far East were deported by the tens of thousands to Kazakhstan, their journey across the steppe marked by hunger and frostbite. Volga Germans, Iranians, and Tatars were accused of espionage for the very nations they had fled decades before. Entire populations were uprooted to prevent a rebellion that existed only in Stalin's imagination. The purges took on the precision of demographic engineering. Maps were redrawn, names erased, languages forbidden. The Soviet Union, a mosaic of nations, was being ground into uniformity. Diversity became danger. Identity became guilt. Stalin was not simply eliminating dissent, he was erasing difference. In official reports, the campaigns were described as preventive security measures. But the truth was simpler: paranoia had replaced ideology. The revolution that once promised to unite humanity under equality now measured worth by conformity. By 1938, the ground beneath the USSR was littered with unmarked graves from Minsk to Vladivostok. The purge had no front lines, no borders, no mercy. It had become a way of life and of death. By the beginning of 1938, the Great Purge had consumed nearly every layer of Soviet life. But Stalin's hunger for control was insatiable, and soon the machine he built began to turn inward, devouring the very men who had operated it. The architects of terror were about to become its victims. Nikolai Yezhov, once the zealous enforcer of Stalin's will, had transformed the NKVD into an empire of blood. He had overseen the mass arrests, the nightly executions, the quotas that turned fear into policy. But now his usefulness was waning. The chaos he unleashed had become too visible, too uncontrolled. Stalin, ever suspicious, began to see in him what he saw in all men: a threat. In late 1938, the tide shifted. Yezhov was quietly dismissed and replaced by Lavrenti Beria, a man more subtle but no less ruthless. Beria's first order was simple: dismantle the excesses of Yezhov's terror and eliminate those responsible. It was the same ritual that had repeated since Lenin's death purge: the purger erase the evidence. Yezhov was arrested in 1939, tortured, and executed in the same Lubyanka basement where he had condemned thousands. His name, like theirs, was struck from the record. The same fate awaited the NKVD officers who had served him. Interrogators who had once wielded absolute power were now accused of fabricating cases and abusing authority. They confessed under torture to crimes they had committed under orders. Some begged for forgiveness. Others laughed bitterly, knowing the system was only reclaiming its own. Stalin's terror had completed its circle, the predator devouring itself. Meanwhile, the nation tried to breathe. A decree issued on November 17, 1938, officially ended the mass operations. Executions slowed, arrests declined, and for the first time in years, the trains to the gulags carried fewer prisoners. But for millions, the damage was irreversible. The population lived in quiet shock like survivors of a storm still waiting for the next thunderclap. In speeches, Stalin spoke of mistakes made by overzealous comrades distancing himself from the carnage. The people pretended to believe him. They applauded when he appeared clapped when told, and thanked him for sparing what remained of their lives. The silence that followed was not relief, it was exhaustion. The Great Purge had ended only because there was nothing left to purge. When the guns of the purge finally fell silent, the Soviet Union was a haunted country. The numbers defied comprehension. At least 700,000 executed, millions more imprisoned or exiled. Yet the true wound was invisible. Trust had been erased from the soul of a nation. People no longer spoke freely, even to their own blood. The habit of fear had become instinct. Factories resumed their quotas. Schools reopened, trains ran on time, but something fundamental was missing. The revolution that once promised brotherhood now demanded silence. Entire communities had been erased, their memory replaced by official lies. Historians would later call it the Great Terror, but for those who survived, it had no name, only the sound of footsteps on the stairs at night. Those footsteps never quite stopped. Even after 1938, smaller purges continued like aftershocks. Scientists, writers, and officers learned to censor their thoughts before they reached their tongues. The NKVD no longer needed to knock. People policed themselves. It was the perfect totalitarian victory, not rule by force, but by anticipation of force. In 1939, as Europe moved toward war, Stalin appeared unshaken. He had survived every rival, outlived every critic, and transformed chaos into control. Foreign diplomats saw a leader of iron discipline. They did not see the cost, the hollow government halls, the vanished names, the frozen archives filled with silence. Those who once served him now lived as ghosts. Some, like Beria, rose higher, pretending the purge had never happened. Others hid behind new titles and new lies, afraid of being remembered. Mothers whispered prayers over unmarked graves. Fathers searched for sons in prison lists that never ended. The state never acknowledged its crime, only its corrections. And yet beneath the fear, something fragile endured. Ordinary people still fell in love, wrote poetry, and sang softly under curfew. Life, even twisted by terror, refused to die. It clung to the smallest spaces, a whispered joke, a shared loaf, a moment of defiance too brief to be seen. The Great Purge had ended, but its echo became eternal. Stalin had built an empire of silence, and silence would become the Soviet Union's truest language. As Europe descended into war in 1939, Stalin stood unchallenged. He had survived the revolution, the famines, the betrayals, and now the purge. His portrait hung above every office, every classroom, every barracks, the face of order after chaos. But beneath that image, the cost of his power was incalculable. The state he had built was both invincible and hollow, a fortress made of fear. The Red Army, rebuilt in haste, was commanded by men who owed their rank not to skill, but to survival. When Hitler's armies turned east in 1941, the consequences of Stalin's terror became clear. Entire divisions collapsed under the first assault, not from cowardice, but from confusion. The generals who could have stopped the invasion were already dead, buried in the purge's unmarked graves. The soldiers fought bravely, but the state that demanded obedience had forgotten how to listen. In private, Stalin was shaken. He retreated from public view, consumed by the possibility that his own purges had destroyed the strength of the revolution. Yet he could never admit it, not to his people, not even to himself. Instead, he rebuilt the myth. The Great Patriotic War, as it would be called, became his redemption. The terror that once devoured his nation was reborn as unity against the invader. The world watched as the Soviet Union rose again, scarred but unbroken. When victory finally came in 1945, Stalin stood on the balcony of the Kremlin watching fireworks over Red Square. The people cheered his name, not knowing that many of those who had won the war would soon be purged again. His rule endured because it was built not on belief, but on exhaustion. After so much suffering, survival itself felt like triumph. In the years that followed, Stalin became less a man than a myth, a face carved into the granite of history. His lies hardened into truth, his crimes into statistics. The silence he created lasted beyond his lifetime, woven into the DNA of the state. The Great Purge had given him absolute power, but at the cost of his humanity and his nation's soul. When Stalin died in March 1953, the news spread through Moscow like an echo that no one dared believe. Crowds filled Red Square as they once had for Lenin, but the grief was uncertain, a mixture of mourning, fear, and relief. The man who had ruled their lives through terror was gone, yet his shadow remained. No one knew how to live without it. In the years that followed, the silence began to crack. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union slowly confronted the ghost it had created. In 1956, during his secret speech, Khrushchev condemned Stalin's crimes before a stunned party congress. He spoke of the purges, the fabricated confessions, the hundreds of thousands murdered in the name of vigilance. His words did not bring justice, only the first breath of truth after decades of suffocation. Across the nation, families reopened wounds that had never healed. Mothers searched archives for the names of their sons. Graves once marked unknown were given back their identities. But there were too many to count, too many to remember. Entire villages were gone, entire generations erased. The state could revise statistics, but not memory. Historians struggled to measure the scale of the terror. Some estimated 700,000, executed others more than 1 million. But the true number could never be known, because it was not only bodies that Stalin destroyed, it was the idea of truth itself. His legacy lived on in fear, in the instinct to obey and the silence that lingered long after his death. For the survivors, memory became rebellion. They whispered names, told forbidden stories, and passed down fragments of truth in kitchens late at night. Their defiance was quiet, but it endured longer than Stalin's empire. The revolution that began with hope had ended in mourning, not with the triumph of ideology, but with the resilience of human memory. And so history remembers not the millions of confessions forced by fear, but the few who refused to forget. The Great Purge was not only a tragedy of death, but a testament to endurance, proof that even in a world built on silence, the truth still found a voice. In the end, Stalin's Great Purge was more than a campaign of terror. It was a transformation of an entire society. What began as a quest to secure his power became a blueprint for controlling thought itself. The Soviet Union emerged from the 1930s alive, but hollowed its people, taught that silence was safety and memory was danger. The revolution that once promised liberation had become a prison built from fear. Decades later, the echoes of that terror still lingered. In every Soviet city stood statues of Stalin's triumphs, but beneath them lay the unmarked graves of those who made them possible. Historians could measure the dead, but not the generations that learned to live without trust, without truth, without voice. The purge had succeeded not only in killing bodies, but in reshaping the mind of a nation. And yet, in the quiet corners of that empire, memory refused to die. Letters hidden in walls, names carved on birch trees, stories whispered across decades all spoke the same defiance that even the most absolute tyranny cannot erase the human need to remember. Today, the Great Purge stands as one of history's starkest warnings. It reveals how fear, when systematized, can turn a nation against itself, how power, when unchecked, devours the very foundations it seeks to preserve. Stalin believed terror would make the Soviet Union immortal. Instead, it left a scar that time could not heal. The empire of silence has fallen, but its lesson endures. When truth is buried, it does not die, it waits.